We're back with another episode of the English Teacher Feature. It's me again, Sam Denno, National Education Lead for Secondary English at Twinkle Educational Publishing. And I'm joined by Nicola Romaine again, the National Education Lead for Primary
English. Hi, Sam.
You do primary and I do secondary.
That's right. It's quite simple, really.
That's how we could, yeah, there we go. So last episode, we spoke about the very first part of section 1 of the 2025 writing framework entitled Why Does Writing Matter? And we went into a lot of depth discussing that and how writing measures up alongside the other key skills that we teach in English. This episode, we're moving on to the next part of the document, and we're going to be talking about the section entitled The Development from Spoken Language to Written Language. I feel particularly interested in this because until recently, I'd given it very little thought, because as a secondary teacher, I'm largely working with young people who already have a degree of fluency with writing. So we've moved a long way past that speaking into writing. But nowadays, I feel fairly evangelical, I'm going to say, evangelical about secondary teachers being able to understand where all of this comes from and actually knowing the foundations of what they're building on. And the brilliant thing is that we've got Nicola here, who has a wealth of experience working with children in the early years and beyond. So I'm kind of confident that I can throw questions at you, Nicola, and you're going to be able to give me some sensible answers.
Well, thank you, Sam. I absolutely agree with you with regards to that evangelical aspect as well, though. I think it's really important that everybody understands the direction of travel, what comes before and what comes afterwards as well. So, likewise, it's really important that primary teachers are fully aware of the expectations in secondary.
How do we approach that? How do we deal with that?
It's professional development, isn't it? And talking and communities of practice across different phases and having that kind of really that professional dialogue, I guess, that, enabling professional dialogue. This podcast itself is a really great starting point for secondary and primary colleagues to tap into both aspects, isn't it?
Way to sell the podcast. Well done. At the top of this section then of the writing framework, it talks about the difference between speech as a natural skill and then writing as an acquired skill. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that works?
Yeah, absolutely. So think of speech as biologically primary. So it's hardwired. And as a child grows, their talk naturally becomes more articulate, just by being in a linguistic environment. But writing is biologically secondary. It's a code that we've invented. So in simple terms, that's it in a nutshell.
That's a fascinating way to frame it. I mean, could we not see speech as a code that we've invented as well? Or is that less of a factor?
Children are absorbing speech in a different way. It's not explicitly taught, is it? So writing, I guess, in the majority of cases, has to be explicitly taught, and it goes through a series of kind of progression or developmental sort of stages, whereas speech is in the environment, isn't it? It's all encompassing from when a child is born. It's absorbed in a different way.
The writing framework stipulates that the acquired skill of writing is a step away from natural speech rhythms, and I quote, involves developing control of language in a way that increasingly is different from everyday conversational speech and must be explicitly taught. It's exactly what you've just said there, really.
Yeah.
Is that true in every case, or do some children begin to develop into those writing functions by themselves without that explicit teaching?
It's a really great question, isn't it? And we've all seen that one child, haven't we, who hands in a story that reads like a published novel, and you think, I can teach them that, that grammatical aspect, that semicolon, whatever it is, punctuation. But if we look more closely, even those children aren't developing those functions by themselves. It comes from somewhere, doesn't it? But by nature, those children are doing it through immersion of some description, whatever that immersion is. So what's happening is a high level form of mimicry. So these are usually the children who have been bathed in that literate language from birth. They've been immersed in that. They've heard thousands of hours of sophisticated sentence structures in audiobooks and bedtime stories every night. They are writing naturally. They're speaking the language of books that they've memorized, actually. So that's their immersion. So for the vast majority of children, the framework is absolutely right. Think about how we talk. So speech is context dependent. We use our hands, we point, we say over there, or that thing. But writing is decontextualized. The reader isn't in the room. You can't point. The language has to do 100% of the work with writing. And that shift from needing a listener to being self-sufficient on the page is a really big cognitive leap. Most children will naturally write exactly how they talk, won't they? And then we went to the park, and then it was fun, and to get them to move into writing functions, so using subordinate clauses or passive voice to create that distance, that requires a teacher to pull back the curtain, doesn't it, and show them how the machinery works. So that kind of explicit instruction. And without that explicit reveal, if you like, most children stay trapped in the rhythms of the playground, which just doesn't work for like an essay or a formal report.
It goes back to the reading thing again. Actually, even if they are not kind of being encoded by teaching, children who have reading from an early age are learning to write because they're reading from an early age.
And that's the whole kind of ethos, I guess, of reading for pleasure, reading for pleasure, isn't it? Is that the children that read for pleasure are the children whose vocabulary is bigger and who with instruction, but writing is still different, isn't it? So I've taught children who don't come from families who read to them every day, but they still have quite large vocabulary. So I think there are a lot of variables in there, aren't there? So, but whichever way you look at it, it's still environmental, I think, from birth. It's either through books and having that kind of nurture of will to read from early on, whereas writing is still different, isn't it? Because with regards to transcription, for example, which is what comes first really with writing, you still have variables there with regards to children who are natural spellers and so forth, don't you? But handwriting, for example, needs to be explicitly taught. Spelling to a degree needs to be explicitly taught. So, and that kind of composition stuff as well needs to be nurtured. So I think it is very different in that way. But coming back to your question about reading, yeah, it is so related to reading. It's unreal. Reading is what feeds the vocabulary, isn't it? Or it certainly adds to the nurture of that vocabulary growth, certainly. That's why reading is so important. And that's why the National Year of Reading and getting that right and the right message is so important.
As a child grows up, their talk becomes more mannered, more articulate. Is there a ceiling to how well they can speak, or does their speech continue to develop and develop, infinitely?
So if we're talking about functional everyday speech, the kind we use to get our needs met or chat with friends, most children hit a plateau once they've mastered basic grammar and social cues, most children. And this is why the DFE's writing framework refers or what the DFE writing framework, I should say, refers to when it distinguishes between conversational language and that academic language required for school, particularly as children get older. So speech can and should continue to develop, but it sort of changes lanes, I guess. It moves from being biologically driven, and I would say environmentally driven as well, to being sort of culturally and academically driven. So I suppose what that looks like is having that exposure factor. So as children grow, their speech only becomes more mannered or sophisticated if they're immersed in that sophisticated or more mannered language. And that's where the ceiling comes in if a child's environment is limited to simple repetitive conversation. Their oral vocabulary will likely stay there. And, the reading aspect comes into that as well, obviously, comes into play there. The reading loop. So the framework suggests that at a certain point, our speech is actually upgraded by our reading. And we start to use words in conversation, words like consequently, analogy, hypothesis, bigger words, basically, that we almost never hear in casual playground talk. So there isn't an upper limit. In that sense, Sam, I don't think an 80-year-old speech can be more articulate than a 40-year-old speech, but, and this is the kicker for us as teachers or educators, that continued growth isn't natural anymore. It's an acquired expansion fed by the books that they read and the formal discussions we lead in the classroom. So the onus is very much, in that respect, on the educator, isn't it?
Right. So are you suggesting that the onus passes from, you've spoken about home environment in the early years, does the onus pass to educators, and at what age is that happening, if so?
I think it's a partnership, isn't it? I think all education should be a partnership between home and school, but we can't control the what's happening in the home environment to a degree, can we? We can't control the conversation that's going on. We can support it, certainly. We can't control what the children are reading at home, but we can certainly support that and encourage that. So because of that, we have to then intervene, don't we, as educators? And we have to make sure that that in school children are given that rich diet of reading, and that we nurture, as well as the skill to read, which is obviously phonics, and developing fluency, we need to nurture that will to read. And one of the reasons for that is to develop their vocabulary, which obviously supports so many different aspects of their lives going forward, academically, socially, all of those different things. It's not just in school, but it very much is in school. We need to take that kind of responsibility of that in such school settings as well, working with homes.
Going back to the framework, then it quotes from Fisher, Jones, Larkin, and Myhill, and says, writing draws on a vocabulary which often requires a repertoire which extends beyond that of spoken vocabulary. I'm thinking about 11-year-olds in year 7 who struggle with writing because they're likely to be more verbally articulate than, say, a 5-year-old. Does that mean that the step across from spoken language to written language is going to be narrower for them because they've already built up a greater vocabulary?
Well, it's a logical assumption, isn't it? But it's actually where we see one of the biggest bottlenecks in education. I think you'd agree with that, Sam. Intellectually, the step is narrower because they have the concepts and that tier 2 vocabulary in their heads, but the cognitive load is actually much higher, isn't it? So think about it. A 5-year-old is writing the cat sat. Their thoughts match their physical ability to write to largely, don't they? Whereas a year 7 student might have a complex kind of multi-clause thought because of their cognitive or their emotional kind of development, if you like, about atmospheric pressure or character motivation. Their brain is at year 7, but their hand, their transcription speed and their spelling automaticity might be stuck at year 4 or earlier. So when they try to bridge that gap, the system crashes in a completely different way to how it sort of impacts, for example, a reception age child, and they lose the thread of their sophisticated thought because they're stuck wondering if, for example, occurrence has 2 C's, So whilst the linguistic step is narrower, the performance gap can feel like a really massive void, I would say, at that stage, where the gap is widening.
I've often said to my pupils who struggle with punctuation, well, say the sentence out loud first. And where are the natural pauses? Are they long pauses? Are they short pauses? And then I'll encourage them to use that as a guide to the use of basic punctuation as they write their sentences out. Is that not really very helpful?
I wouldn't say it's bad. Quite a short answer, really. I would say it's an unreliable compass. It's a brilliant starting point for sentence sense, helping a pupil realize that a sentence isn't an infinite string of words, for example. It grounds punctuation in something physical in that respect. But here's why the framework pushes us towards a more explicitly taught sort of grammatical approach. Speech is rhythmic, but writing is structural.
And it is at pains to point out, though, that one leads to another, but they are distinct. They are different disciplines. I thought that the closing paragraph of this section was really important, where it says, in teaching pupils to write, therefore, teachers must support them to make links between talking and writing, and to continue to use one to support the other. Pupils may, for example, use talk to generate and discuss ideas for writing. And I love that word continue in that statement, because when we talk about the importance of oracy more generally, this is the sort of thing that we're talking about, isn't it? And this has as much relevance in Key Stage 1 as it does in Key Stage 4, and then all of those stages in between. Speech can continue to be a way into writing, whether that's in primary school or in secondary school, or with a very low ability learner or a high ability learner. And that's sort of talking through a problem or verbalizing an idea first before putting pen to paper is hugely valuable. There are times where we'll set a speaking task for our learners, and they'll sort of go away and just talk about, I don't know, talk about their Xbox. And that's why we should encourage our pupils not to waste time when we ask them to discuss something in pairs or groups, because actually we're asking them to create the seed, aren't we? That discussion is the beginning of the writing process, and that's their way in one sense.
I'm a big fan of kind of explaining, probably, I think I said this in the previous podcast actually, explaining to pupils why we're doing something, making it clear to them that the discussion, the important part that discussion plays in that writing process as well, I think is really, really important. So it's clear that they are actually, it's a tool that will eventually support their writing.
Is there one tried and tested strategy that you have that would encourage that speech to writing effect?
If I had to pick one to talk about, it would be oral sentence stacking with scaffolding. So this is a strategy that takes oracy and gives it that explicit structure that the writing framework demands, and it prevents that bottleneck that I spoke about earlier from occurring. So it separates the thinking from the writing, which is really, really important. So it's a 3-step cycle that you repeat for every single sentence in a paragraph. So what you would do is you would provide pupils with a stimulus. It could be anything, image, film, object, whatever. They would collect vocabulary, so not in written form, but orally, prompted by questions such as, where are the tier 2 verbs? Instead of ran, can we say bolted or scrambled? You're expanding their vocabulary. You would provide a specific constraint. So, for example, this sentence must start with a fronted adverbial of time. And then it would be partner words. So pupils would turn to their partners and, they're not allowed to pick up the pencil or their pen yet. They have to say their sentence out loud, using the vocabulary bin and the grammatical lens as well. So you're training them to do that, to make those choices. And the partner's job would be to listen and to edit it, but orally. So, for example, the feedback might be, that sounds good, but could you swap scared for petrified, that kind of thing. So what you're doing here essentially is using the natural ease of speech to filter out the errors before they become permanent on, in the written word on the page. So by the time the pupil actually writes the sentence, they've already heard it. Really, really important. We all know that, don't we? They've rehearsed the rhythm and they've checked the grammar. And it proves the point that we made earlier, that discussion is the beginning of the writing process. And when we value that paired talk, we aren't wasting time. It's not just a time filler. We're building the bridge, and that's how it needs to be perceived. And we're moving from the playground voice to the authorial voice through the power of the spoken word.
That sounds brilliant. If you are to run that exercise, do you find that then you have to sort of correct afterwards in terms of grammar, because we've said those rules of speech are different to the rules of writing?
I think you've got to intervene in those respects, definitely. Do you mean as an educator, as a teacher?
Yeah, potentially, or at least get the pupil to check the grammar.
You've got to empower the pupils to check the grammar, definitely, haven't you?
Yeah,
and that's part of the conversation and the discussion, I think, is to really, really grow and make the most of those kind of paired or group discussions, and training the children to be able to really tap into the grammar and basically correct it as they go along. Not be scared of getting it wrong. I think that's really important as well, because that's how we learn, isn't it? And listening to the sentence with a particular grammatical structure within it, and being able to feed back and forth that that's not right, and why isn't it right? What would be better?
It's a cycle, isn't it? So in a sense, you could sort of run that activity kind of ad infinitum. You could do speech into writing, into speech into writing, and so on.
Oral to written feedback loop in a way, isn't it? I suppose that the input from the teacher, is the literate model from reading, from books, and the pupil speaks the structure. I guess that's the natural skill. So that's that oral rehearsal, and then the pupil codes the speech into text. So that's that kind of acquired skills. That brings us back to the beginning of this podcast, where we were talking about that kind of biologically natural versus kind of environmental or taught, explicitly taught kind of aspect. And then the review. So that's what you're talking about now, is the pupil is encouraged or taught to read their own work aloud to check for meaning, and round we go in that kind of loop.
It's formative assessment as well, isn't it? It's sort of a perfect model of formative assessment. This has been brilliant, Nicola. Once again, you have been a veritable fountain of knowledge. So thank you. You can get in touch with us on twinklepod@twinkle.co.uk, and we love to hear from you. Thanks so much for listening. Thank you, Nicola, for talking, and goodbye for now.
Bye, everyone.